911, what's your emergency?
It's my son! Something happened! You have to send someone! Please!
Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. What happened to your son?
Gabriel! His name is Gabriel. He was harassed. At St. Cecilia Church. By a nun.
Did you say a nun?
Yes. Sister Annabelle. She manipulated him. Touched him. He told me everything.
Lisa's fingers froze over her keyboard. She had been with the department for over 10 years, but never, not once, had she heard something like this. "Where's your son now?" she asked.
In his room. He's scared. He didn't want to tell me, but I knew something was wrong. I pressed him, and he just broke.
All right, ma'am. I'm sending officers to your location. We'll need to speak with Gabriel.
As she hung up, the weight of the situation hit her. This wasn't just another case. This was about St. Cecilia Church, the heart of their small town. The Rivera home sat on a quiet street, just a few blocks from the church. By the time officers arrived, whispers were already spreading. In a town like this, news traveled fast. Neighbors peeked through curtains as the police cars pulled up. Mrs. Rivera, a woman in her early 40s with tired eyes, opened the door quickly. Her hands trembled as she walked them inside. Gabriel sat on the couch, his face pale, his hands clenched together in his lap. He was only 19, but in that moment, he looked much younger. "Gabriel, we just want to understand what happened. Can you tell us?" Detective Harris spoke gently. It started months ago," he whispered. "She told me she was helping me, that she was guiding me." He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. But it wasn't guidance. It wasn't right. The officers exchanged glances. The tension in the room was heavy, suffocating. This was serious. This would change everything. By the next morning, St. Cecilia Church was buzzing with rumors. The church stood tall in the center of town, its old stone walls weathered but strong. For generations, families had come here to worship, to celebrate, to mourn. It wasn't just a church. It was part of their lives. And Sister Annabelle? She had been there for years. A woman of faith, of kindness. Parents trusted her. People sought her guidance. She had always been respected. But now, everything was different. Did you hear? That nun, Annabelle. They're saying she did something to one of the boys. No way. She's been here forever. That can't be true. I don't know. The police were at Gabriel's house last night. Doubt. Fear. The town was starting to split, their trust in St. Cecilia beginning to crack. And deep inside the church, Sister Annabelle knelt in prayer. Her hands were clasped tight. Her lips moved in silent words. But behind her closed eyes, something stirred, something closer to fear than faith. The candlelight flickered against the stone walls of St. Cecilia Church, casting long shadows over Sister Annabelle's bowed figure. She knelt at the altar, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her lips moved in whispered prayers, but her mind was elsewhere. She had spent years serving this church, dedicating her life to faith, to discipline, to denial. But lately, something inside her had begun to shift. The silence of the church, once comforting, now felt suffocating. The weight of her vows pressed down on her like an unbearable chain. She had taken an oath to resist temptation, to devote herself to purity, but her body refused to forget what it longed for. At night, when she lay alone in her small, cold room, she felt it creeping in, the hunger, the aching need. It was wrong, sinful, but it was also inescapable. She prayed harder, stayed later at the church, hoping that devotion would burn these feelings away. But the more she fought them, the stronger they became. May 15th, 2014. The first time Annabelle truly noticed Gabriel. He was sitting near the back of the church, his dark eyes fixed on her. He had been coming to Mass regularly, always quiet, always observant. But that evening, as she glanced up from her reading, she caught him staring. Their eyes met. Just for a second, her breath hitched. She quickly looked away, her pulse racing. It's nothing, she told herself. Just a young man seeking guidance. But something about the way he looked at her stayed with her. After the service, she watched him stay, speaking with a few others before slipping outside. The next time she saw him, she noticed the same thing. His gaze finding her, holding for just a moment too long. It was subtle, almost innocent, but not quite. At first, Annabelle convinced herself that she was imagining it, reading too much into things. Yet, she found herself seeking him out, stealing glances during Mass, watching the way he carried himself. He was young, yes, but not a child. 19. A man. A dangerous thought crept into her mind. She crushed it immediately. May 22nd, 2014. It was a warm evening, the air thick with the scent of old wood and burning candles. The church was almost empty. Annabelle was gathering him books when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, and there he was, Gabriel. "Good evening, sister," he said softly. Annabelle nodded, trying to steady herself. "Gabriel, can I help you?" He hesitated, his hands in his pockets. "I just wanted to thank you for your sermons. They've helped me a lot." She smiled, relieved. "This is good. This is fine. I'm glad to hear that," she said, keeping her tone light. But then a pause. Gabriel looked at her, really looked at her, and she felt it. The air between them shifted, humming with something unspoken, forbidden. "You seem different than the others," he murmured. "More real." Annabelle's heart pounded. "I'm just doing my duty," she replied, forcing a laugh. Gabriel's gaze didn't waver. "I don't think it's just duty." She should have shut it down then. Should have told him not to speak that way. Should have walked away. But instead, she stood there, unable to move, unable to breathe, caught in a moment she did not want to end. The days blurred together in a haze of stolen glances and unspoken words. Annabelle told herself that nothing had changed, that she was still in control. But deep down, she knew better. May 29th, 2014. Gabriel had started seeking her out more often. At first, it had been under the guise of faith. Questions about Scripture, about the meaning of devotion. But as the days passed, his word became more personal. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked one evening as they stood in the empty nave. Annabelle frowned. "Regret what?" "Your vows." She stiffened. "Gabriel, that's not something I'm just asking," he interrupted, his voice soft but insistent. "You've given up everything. Don't you ever feel lonely?" The way he said it, his eyes locked onto hers, his meaning clear, made her throat go dry. She wanted to walk away. She should have. But instead, she stayed. And that was the moment she lost control. June 1st, 2014. The sun had long since set, but Annabelle remained in the church, pretending to busy herself with meaningless tasks. She knew he was waiting. Gabriel had approached her earlier that evening, his voice low, his expression serious. "I need to talk to you. Not here, after Massachusetts. Behind the church." She should have said no. She should have ignored him. But when the last of the congregation had gone and the silence settled over the churchyard, she found herself stepping into the shadows where he waited. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of crickets in the warm summer night. Then Gabriel exhaled. "I can't stop thinking about you." Annabelle's breath caught. "Gabriel, don't tell me you don't feel it too." She did, and that terrified her. She opened her mouth to argue, to deny it, but then he reached out. His fingers brushed against her wrist, and everything unraveled. It was just a kiss at first, a moment of weakness, a brief surrender to something neither of them could fight anymore. But once the line was crossed, there was no going back. June 5th, 2014. The affair began in secrecy, unfolding in the quiet corners of St. Cecilia Church, behind the confession booth, in the candlelit storage room, in whispered conversations between prayers. They found excuses to be alone. careful not to be seen. At night, Annabelle would lie awake, guilt gnawing at her, only to give in again the next day. Gabriel was relentless, intoxicating in a way she never thought possible. His touch was fire, his words a temptation she could no longer resist. But temptation had consequences. Others in the church started to notice the change. Some of the younger men whispered among themselves. Their curiosity piqued. But curiosity could turn into suspicion, and suspicion was dangerous. June 7, 2014. Pastor Lawrence Whitmore had served St. Cecilia Church for over 30 years. He had seen young priests come and go, watched the town change in slow, inevitable ways, but he had never once questioned devotion of Sister Annabelle. Until now, lately, he had noticed something off about her. It wasn't just the way she carried herself, more distracted, less composed, but also how she interacted with Gabriel Parker. The boy had always been reserved, but lately, there was a new confidence in him, a shift in how he carried himself whenever Annabelle was near. Their exchanges were quick, their eye contact lingering a moment too long. At first, Pastor Lawrence dismissed it as his misjudgment. Annabelle was a nun, after all, a woman of God, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and once it took root, it was impossible to ignore. So he started watching, and the more he watched, the more he saw. And Gabriel wasn't the only one. June 12, 2014. The church was quiet that night. The last prayers whispered, the last candles burning low. Pastor Lawrence had stayed behind, pretending to review sermon notes, but in truth, he was waiting. His instincts had never failed him before. The sound of soft voices drew his attention to the far end of the church. Hidden in the dim candlelight, he moved silently, peering around the heavy wooden columns. And there she was, Sister Annabelle, in the shadowed alcove near the confession booth. But she wasn't alone. A young man, not Gabriel, stood close to her, too close. He whispered something in her ear, his hand brushing against hers. And then Pastor Lawrence felt his stomach drop. Annabelle leaned in. It was brief but undeniable, a moment of intimacy no nun should ever share. For a long moment, he simply stood there, heart pounding, unable to believe what he had just seen. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. June 14th, 2014. The church elders gathered in a dimly lit room behind the altar. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the conversation heavier than the wooden cross hanging on the wall. Pastor Lawrence had told them everything. "This cannot continue," Elder Miriam Tate said, her voice firm. "Sister Annabelle has taken sacred vows. She cannot remain here if she has broken them." "But what do we do?" Another elder, Jonathan Graves, asked. "Do we confront her? Or do we go straight to the bishop?" "Confronting her quietly might be best," Elder Richard Holloway suggested. "If we involve the diocese too soon, this could become a scandal." "It is a scandal," Pastor Lawrence said darkly. The room fell silent. They all knew the truth. If word is spread, it would destroy St. Cecilia's reputation. Their church had always been a place of faith and purity, untouched by controversy until now. June 20th, 2014. It started as whispers in the pews. At first, only a handful of congregants noticed. The way Sister Annabelle had become distant, the way certain young men watched her too closely. "Have you noticed how she acted around the boys?" someone murmured. "It's probably nothing," another dismissed. But then someone else spoke up. "My son said she's been spending a lot of time with Gabriel Parker. And now I see her whisper with others too." Doubt spread like wildfire. Some called it gossip, but others, those who had seen the way Annabelle looked at certain men, grew suspicious. And in a town as devout as theirs, suspicions had a way of turning into accusations. October 1st, 2014. Gabriel sat at the edge of his bed, his hands shaking as he stared at the floor. The weight of his secret had become unbearable, suffocating him with each passing day. He had told himself that what had happened between him and Sister Annabel was different, that it wasn't wrong, that it was love. But deep down, he knew the truth. And so, on October 1st, he did something he never thought he would. He told his mother. At first, Margaret Parker thought she had misheard him. "What are you saying, Gabriel?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "Sister Annabel and it wasn't just spiritual guidance." No, that's not possible. She's a nun, Gabriel." "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered. "It's true." Margaret felt her stomach turn. She had raised her son to be a good, God-fearing young man. And now, he was telling her he'd been involved with a woman of God. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the phone. She had to report this. October 3rd, 2014. By the time word reached the church elders, the entire foundation of St. Cecilia Church felt as if it were cracking beneath them. Sister Annabel sat in the dimly lit meeting room, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale but composed. Across from her sat Pastor Lawrence and 3 other elders, their faces grim. "Annabel," Pastor Lawrence began, his voice cold, "we receive a very serious report about your conduct." She said nothing. "You are being relieved of your duties immediately," Elder Miriam added, her gaze heavy with disappointment. "An investigation is underway." Annabel swallowed hard. "This is not up for discussion." Pastor Lawrence cut in. "You have broken the trust of this church, of this town. There is nothing left to say." For the first time, fear flickered in Annabel's eyes. She had convinced herself that what she and Gabriel shared was a moment of weakness, not a crime. But now, reality was crashing down around her. October 5th, 2014. The police arrived at the church early in the morning. The moment they stepped inside, the whispers turned to silence. Annabel stood in the center of the sanctuary as the officers approached. The candlelight flickered against the stone walls, casting long shadows. "Sister Annabel, we need to ask you some questions," one of them said. The townspeople watched in horror. Some gasped, others crossed themselves, murmuring prayers as they witnessed the unthinkable, a nun being questioned by the police. By nightfall, the town of St. Cecilia was in chaos. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some believed Annabel was innocent, a victim of false accusations. Others were not so sure. And a few claimed they had always sensed something was off about her. October 10th, 2014. As the investigation deepened, more young men were brought in for questioning. Some refused to speak, their faces pale with fear. Others, however, confessed to things they never should have experienced within the sacred walls of the church. And with each confession, the walls around Annabel closed in tighter. October 15th, 2014. By the time the investigation concluded, the decision was final. Sister Annabel was removed from St. Cecilia Church. She was sent away for counseling, her once pristine reputation shattered beyond repair. The church tried to move on, but the stain of the scandal would never fully fade. And as for Gabriel, he would never step foot inside Street Cecilia again. Because no matter how much time passed, one truth remained. He had loved her once, and it had ruined them both. The town of St. Cecilia was never the same after the scandal. For decades, the church had been a pillar of faith, a place of guidance and purity. Now it was tainted, its reputation forever scarred by the sins committed within its walls. Some members of the congregation refused to speak of it, as if silence could erase the shame. Others couldn't stop arguing, divided between those who saw Annabel as a fallen woman and those who saw her as a predator. She was just a woman, not a saint, an elderly woman whispered at Sunday service. She made a mistake, like anyone else. "A mistake?" a younger man shot back. "She was a nun, for God's sake." She knew what she was doing. The debate never truly ended. But while the town bickered, Gabriel was drowning in his own torment. Gabriel had stopped going to church. He had once found comfort in the worn wooden pews, in the quiet hum of prayers whispered in unison. Now, The very thought of stepping inside St. Cecilia made him feel sick. Guilt clung to him like a second skin. He couldn't figure out how to feel about Annabelle anymore. At night, he would lie awake, remembering the way she had looked at him. Not as a nun, but as a woman. He had wanted her. He had pursued her, flirted, pushed boundaries. But then, why did it all feel so wrong now? Had he been a willing participant? Or had he been led into something he never should have been part of? The question haunted him. And he wasn't the only one suffering. The other young men caught in the scandal had their battles to fight. Some left Street Cecilia entirely, unable to face the whispers that followed them. Others tried to bury the shame, pretending nothing had happened. One boy, just 16 years old, stopped speaking altogether, his parents too ashamed to seek help. The weight of what had happened crushed them all, even those who had never meant for it to go so far. Far from Street Cecilia, Annabelle lived in exile. The counseling center was small, tucked away in a quiet town where no one knew her name. She spent her days in solitude, reflecting on the choices that had led her here. She had broken her vows, betrayed her faith, and shattered the trust of those who had once looked up to her. But was she truly a monster? Time passed, but the questions remained. For some, Annabelle was a villain, a woman who had used her position to take advantage of young, impressionable men. For others, she was a lost soul, crushed beneath the weight of a life she had never truly wanted. A final question lingers in the air. Was Annabelle a predator, a lost soul, or just a woman who could no longer fight the desires she had suppressed for so long?